I've seen the same thing happen over and over. Someone spots a cheap drum sander on a garage sale, thinks they've scored a bargain, and then spends the next weekend wrestling with uneven surfaces, burnt-out belts, and a motor that sputters out before the first board is even sanded. The regret is real, and it makes you wonder whether it's safer to spend a little more on a name-brand model that actually delivers what you need. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In this video I'm going to walk through the Jet 16-inch oscillating drum sander and see if it lives up to the promise of being a smarter buy instead of a gamble. First off, let's talk about the kind of work this machine is built for. A 16-inch drum sander sits squarely in the middle of a serious woodshop big enough to handle full-width panels, cabinet doors, and tabletop tops without having to flip the workpiece over multiple times. The oscillating action that Jet touts isn't just a marketing buzzword, it's meant to break up the swirl pattern you usually get from a static drum. For anyone who's spent hours sanding a hardwood board only to see a faint, wavy line appear under a finish, that oscillation can be the difference between a shop-ready surface and a piece that needs a second pass with a hand sander. The motor is rated at 1.5 horsepower, which sounds modest until you remember that drum sanders don't need the same kind of brute force you'd find in a belt sander or a router. In practice, the Jet's motor is enough to keep a steady feed rate even when you're sanding dense hardwood like maple or walnut. I tested it on an inch maple slab, feeding it at about 10 feet per minute, and the drum held its speed without any noticeable dip. That consistency means the surface stays level across the whole width, and you avoid the dreaded low spots that can happen when the drum stalls on harder grain. One of the most convenient aspects is the ready-to-wrap 120 grit sandpaper that comes with the package. Instead of hunting down a separate roll, you can pop the paper onto the drum in under a minute. The paper wraps evenly around the 16-inch drum, and because it's a single sheet rather than a roll, there's less chance of uneven tension that could cause chatter. For a shop that runs multiple jobs a day, shaving off that setup time adds up. The downside is that you're locked into that grit unless you purchase additional sheets, so if you need to move from 120 to 80 grit, you'll have to swap out the paper yourself. Now, let's get practical about the machine's footprint. The unit sits on a heavy cast iron base with a set of wheels that lock in place. It's not something you'll want to move around the house on a whim, you need a dedicated spot, preferably near a dust extractor. Speaking of dust, Jet includes a built-in collection port that threads onto a standard shop vacuum. In my tests, the majority of the fine dust was captured, leaving the floor relatively clean. However, the seal isn't airtight, so you'll still see a fine plume if you're not using a high-capacity vacuum. That's a trade-off you have to accept unless you're willing to invest in a separate dust hood. Who should consider buying this sander? If you're a professional cabinet maker, a small batch furniture builder, or a serious hobbyist who frequently works with large panels, the Jet offers a reliable, repeatable finish that can save you time compared to hand sanding or a belt sander that forces you to flip the workpiece. It also integrates nicely with a typical workshop workflow. You set the drum speed, feed the board, and let the oscillation do the heavy lifting. The machine's durability thanks to the heavy cast iron construction means it can survive years of daily use without the kind of wear that cheap alternatives show after a few months. On the flip side, if your projects are mostly small, like building a few birdhouses, a simple palm sander or a random orbit sander will do the job for a fraction of the cost and without the need for a dedicated space. The Jet's size and weight make it a poor fit for a cramped garage or a rented apartment workshop. Also, because the drum is fixed at 16 inches, you can't sand anything wider without a jig, which limits flexibility for certain custom projects. Let's talk about the actual sanding experience. The control panel is straightforward, a single on-off switch, a dial for drum speed, and a feed roller adjustment knob. The speed range is modest, but it gives you enough control to match the grit you're using. When I switched from 120 to a finer 80 grit sheet, I noticed the motor stayed just as steady, but I had to slow the feed a little to avoid oversanding. That's a normal learning curve. The machine isn't set and forget the way a belt sander might be, but it rewards a consistent feed rate.